Hey, Kua.
Hey, Kendra.
We're back.
We're back for another episode.
Yes, and so we're trying to keep up this consistency to
Right,
give y'all some
right.
content because, people be asking.
We are getting asked more in the community. It's interesting because I've been frequenting a couple places and people have, come up and said, hey, we see that you're back.
Yes.
What you guys got going on? What's going to, be on the episodes upcoming?
And we have no shortage of material.
Right, and potential guests.
Yes.
So we're going to dive right in. We got a hot topic that we wanted to discuss, but there's also some other news that we're going to discuss today as well. So
absolutely.
Let's jump right in.
All right, you want to dive in or do you want me to? Okay, go ahead.
You know what? Okay, so there's been a lot that's been happening within the community around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but specifically in Florida, right? And so the Yahoo News article says that Florida University closes DEI office, eliminates 13 positions, and moves $5 million to comply with state rules. And so I know in like the last episode, we just talked about some of the efforts that have been happening around anti-DEI measures at this point and how that's been rolling out. And now we see a real significant case of how that's happened. And so it said that the University of Florida has closed its DEI office, eliminated those 13 positions to comply with the new state rules and regulations. They closed the office, they eliminated the chief diversity officer role, administrative appointments, and halted all DEI-focused contracts with outside vendors as well. 13 positions and 15 administrative appointments were eliminated, and a $5 million that was set aside for DEI initiatives, including salaries, expenditures, would now be reallocated to a faculty recruitment fund through the Office of the Provost, the university said. And so Governor Ron DeSantis had some words around that on X. He said that DEI is toxic and has no place in our public universities. And there were a lot of different comments around that as well. But it's under attack, y'all. And we've been talking about this, but now we see real action that's happening, in a state. And he's hoping that other states follow suit.
Absolutely. And he goes on to say that he's glad that Florida was the first state to eliminate DEI, and I hope more states follow suit. As Kua just talked about. And we know that there are more states that are following suit, right? Because how many bills are out there right now?
So right now there are 40 anti-DEI bills that are targeting DEI efforts, wanting to eliminate those roles, calling it discrimination. They're also targeting specific funds that look to fund on the basis of race. I think it's race and gender.
So a lot of the scholarships that are historically were offered to a certain demographic are now being not necessarily pulling back, but changing the language.
Right.
Because now they can't be race-based or gender-based applications.
Yeah. So, and you're seeing that, right?
Yes.
So like foundations are also doing that at this point, and they're moving away from specific language around race and gender, and now they're saying more generic things around like socioeconomic status and, who potentially would fit within these certain demographics, not race or gender, which I don't know. How do you feel about that?
For me, because we've been entrenched in this work for a very long time, even before it was even called DEI, right? And so no matter what you call it, the work still has to be done. And so we just have to be creative and find different avenues and ways to continue to diversify on all fronts, from the college and university perspective, from organizations, and then also to try to pull in some of those funds that address some of those issues and problems. And so historically, we've seen, we're not saying historically, but in the past 4 years, we've seen a lot of Black women who are in these roles, right? A lot of people who are supporting these organizations, and they're the first ones to go. Right? And so we have to continue to be creative to put us in other positions of power in these organizations and not just be pigeonholed to DEI.
It's interesting that you say that. I was having this conversation with a friend actually just a couple nights ago, and he had asked specifically around these roles, like what other types of roles do you see an influx of people of color and women being positioned in, right? I think, we talked about HR, human resources. You'll see a lot more Black women, people of color that are in that space. But when it comes to other areas, what does that look like? And I know a lot of the organizations we've worked with, they're all trying to diversify either a manager level role, leadership level roles. And they're like, how do we do that when there's really no open spaces? I think this really created an opportunity to put people in that type of position and role. But that means that some things have to change. And there's a lot of frontline staff that might identify as people of color or women. But in terms of how you start to position that, those were conversations that happened after 2020 and what people were talking about.
Right. And I was reading an article recently, too. They were saying that a lot of women specifically are also going into corporate social responsibility and that arm as well, which we know that arm controls the funds and where it's going and where it's being allocated into communities.
Yeah.
So that is another avenue. And then to your point about where are we placing people in these positions, and I think, Kua, you said this a few weeks ago on the panel about white rage that was sponsored by Say Yes. You had talked about putting people in these positions that affect where they can affect culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because typically we always say that people don't leave companies, they leave bad bosses, right? And so if you put people into these positions that can help influence culture, then that is another way of that we can try to kind of win as well.
And I think that's what people are doing, right? Because they know that this is under attack, they're now trying to walk back and say, okay, this is now an HR function again.
Yes.
It's culture. Some folks have talked about operationalizing it from that lens, but now it's a real question. Like, where is it going? What's going to happen? I think this election plays a large role in that.
Absolutely.
We know that there's a lot of dog whistles that are being blown, and they're using, we talked about co-opting words like woke. We had a conversation about that on the podcast at some point, but now DEI being used in that same lens, and the case around meritocracy, we talked about that. We're actually going to have a podcast episode where we talk about the myth of meritocracy and what that looks like if you flip it on its head. One of the other components I think to consider is, where does this leave us, right? And all this work, all the dollars that were allocated. Now you see the University of Florida, they're talking about taking that back and putting it in recruitment. But the same laws that they're challenging around gender and race, I'm wondering how that's going to flip if you now say, we're going to put this money in recruiting and we're suing on this basis. Will people now be able to sue on the opposite end of that you're not as diverse? I don't know what that would look like, but
it's going to be very interesting. It's almost on the same premise of how people are suing for reverse discrimination.
Exactly.
Right. It's along the same premise and what that language looks like. Right. So it's going to be very interesting. I know the other piece of it is when you talk about recruiting and things like that. And when you're looking at it from a student perspective. So there are a lot of lawmakers who are saying, don't go to the Floridas and don't go to some of these other states that are anti-DEI because you don't want to just be used for your athleticism to make the college money.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so that is another way of a protest, right? We saw a couple of years ago where there were some players, specifically basketball players, who were going to HBCUs and taking their talents. They were top in the country and taking their talents to HBCU. So, I mean, there is power in numbers, right? And it's going to take a concerted effort, right? And it's not going away. Right. But we just have to keep pushing.
Well, I mean, that was the case, I think, around Deion Sanders, where was he at? Was it Jackson State?
I
forget now.
Yeah, I think that sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar. Jamil. Okay, yes. See, Jamil's our checkpoint
Jamil in the background. Shout out to Jamil Cruz.
But yeah, it was Jackson State, and that's why there was a lot of conversation around, man, now you have some of the top athletes that were going to be going to these larger schools considering the HBCU because now you had someone like a Deion Sanders who was there. But there were a lot of questions around funding, resources, and what that would look like long term. But it'll be an interesting conversation now as people start to really implement anti-DEI laws. So what does that look like for University of Florida, who, is taking away the DEI measures? What does that mean as a student, right? Like we know a lot of these organizations that we work with at this point, the people that are coming in, if you don't have DEI focused initiatives, they're saying that younger generations are not going to come in your organization. They're asking questions around culture. They're asking questions around, your stance on things like this. I know one of the first episodes we recorded was about corporate social justice and what that looks like. And I feel like we've moved so far from that conversation 4 years ago. 4 years ago.
We started this pod 4 years ago.
Right? Like even considering that, it's been some time.
Yes,
it's been some time.
It has been some time. But it's also interesting just to see, again, the timeline of how everything has shifted so quickly. But also like the places, the pivotal moments of where they have shifted. I mean, we see now where we are, it really started with, there's a lot of things you could say was a catalyst, but I think about affirmative action, right? And you would think that affirmative action, I had a conversation with someone recently, they were saying, well, initially affirmative action was just for colleges and universities. Yes, but it has a trickle-down effect, as we're seeing now. It has a huge trickle-down effect. I mean, with the Fearless Fund and all these different things, like it's all building on each other. But I always say that if we weren't making progress and moving the needle, then you wouldn't have the resistance coming back at you this strongly.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because there are other things that are happening even on a global scene. It was actually France who, remember the law, it was just, a couple days ago, where they passed this bill in anticipation, just in case people in France got the idea that Americans did around abortion.
Yes.
And so they're like, listen, we see what y'all in the West are doing. We want to fortify our measures and efforts to make sure that that doesn't come over in these parts.
Right.
And you know, France, they're known, right? They take a large stance in civil matters and different things like that. And so just to kind of see how this picture is being painted in the U.S. and what that looks like across the globe is really interesting too, you know?
Yeah. So I guess we'll see, but you know, 2024 is a huge political year.
Right.
There's so many other things that kind of play on each other. The attacks on DEI, the attack on women's rights. Yeah. And even our LGBTQ community, like all of these things. And one thing we talk about all the time is that, you know, and I was just talking to Kua about this last night, and it's just quick anecdotal story, but I was in the airport and I had my earbuds in and I heard someone mention DEI, so of course I take my earbuds out. Right. And I'm like, okay, I wonder what they're talking about. And this guy who is sitting in a wheelchair, sitting like legit wheelchair bound, says, I wish they'd get rid of this DEI thing. And I'm like, it affects you too. Right. You know, and I think that's the other thing. People don't realize that it literally affects everyone. Right. Once one person wins, we all win. Yeah. So if you want to take rid of DEI, let's take away your wheelchair. You know what I mean? It's like, or your accessibility to get from point A to B to the gate. Right. You know what I mean? Like, and people don't realize, they see DEI, as you said, DEI equals black. Right. And I think that's the reality for a lot of, you know, people at the end of the day, is they equate it to specific measures. So it's either black, I think it's LGBTQ, specifically trans folks that, you know, they're targeting now. But at the end of the day, one of the things, and we talked about this last night, but I think we have to do a better job at talking about how this is really influencing people in a way that impacts them, right? And so I think when you think about the co-opting of messages and how certain groups have said, you know what, DEI means anti-white or anti-male or anti-this, we got to come back and say, no, this is what this truly means, right? So even in the example you gave, it made me think about the curb cut effect. And that came out of the American Disability Act, where in the sidewalks, they did these curb cuts and it was for accessibility. Right. Guess what? Not only did it help people in wheelchairs, you know, it helped people that had strollers that are pushing that, luggage that were, you know, dragging that, dollies if you're unpacking things. And so when you solve for the people who are most disenfranchised, and we usually talk about this, it really helps everyone benefit. But if you have this in your mind that, DEI means anti-me, then it doesn't really matter. We're losing the conversation before we even begin, unfortunately. Yeah, you know? So we have to do a lot more education, and also to talk about the impact, as you talked about. Yeah. And we're not where we were 4 years ago. We're not where we were 2 years ago. We have to really talk about the actions and the impact, and how do we move past that. Yeah. So, whoa, man, it's a lot. It's a lot. it's always a lot. And that's always, you know, the conversation is like, you know, I think one of the other things that we'll mention, and we want to try to get some guests actually on our podcast to talk about this. We've seen an influx in people just leaving the role to be, you know, like they're just leaving out of these roles. They're tired, they're burnt out. You're really trying to change larger systems. You're coming into these systems and thinking it's all on my back, and you're starting to see people drop out. Now, I know the average tenure of a chief diversity officer is around 18 months, which is insane in itself. And that just shows, look, it's a lot of work. I think as somebody who's been in that role before, not only are you trying to fight within systems and change systems and influence systems, you know, through relationship building, through metrics, data, but you also got to deal with staff who see you as, oh, you're going to be my answer to all my needs. Right. And so they expect you to get in there and do some magic, hocus pocus, and make everything, you know, different tomorrow. And you're balancing some of the pressures of that and the job that you're there to do. And so you're starting to see a lot more people have conversations around that. On LinkedIn the other day, we saw a post that we shared, and there was a Black woman who said, look, I'm stepping away from it. For my own mental health, for my own sanity, I have to step away from this. And there was conversations around this whole superwoman wearing this hero cape,
and what that looks like, and how can you really sustain that over a long period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. And so two things. One thing is I was reading a Forbes article today, and they were talking about misalignment burnout. And so they talk about regular burnout and what that means.
Yep.
But now they're talking about misalignment burnout, right? Saying that, so you're in these roles, right? And this is a role that many people, again, looked at so many people of being that savior, putting on that superwoman coat or Superman coat. But it's like there's a misalignment because my skills go past this, right?
Yeah.
And I have so much more to offer than being strictly just DEI, right? And so for me, I've experienced misalignment burnout, right? And the news that I have is that I most recently was removed from my DEI position at my company, where they decided that, hey, this is not the direction in which we may want to go, right? And so I'm a free agent, y'all.
Yeah.
I'm a free agent, and but also too, you know, many people have checked in, which I'm like, thank you for all the friends and family who have checked in, but I'm truly at peace because that Forbes article really resonated with me with that misalignment burnout, because there was no way that I would have continued in a role like that at any company, right, without necessarily getting the resources, the tools, but then also too just knowing where we are and where we're going.
Right.
Most recently, I was down in DC with the National Urban League, and we were talking about just the state of Black America and where we're going. And one of the things was DEI, and the Congressional Black Caucus really called out organizations to double down on their DEI efforts, right? And so there are some companies, and one thing we did say, there are some companies who are doubling down, right? And so for as many companies that we're saying are getting rid of DEI and backing away, there are still many companies who are doubling down on that. So shout out to them. But those who are getting rid of DEI is because of these political pressures or because, again, they don't necessarily understand what it looks like, right? And so now you're leaving this gap. And, again, I don't care if you call it respectful workplace. I don't care what the work still needs to get done. It has to be done.
Absolutely.
The work still has to be done no matter what. Otherwise, you're not, as we talked about, you're not keeping top talent. You're not keeping these fresh new ideas or being innovative at all, because, like I said, this Gen Z population, their turnover and their attrition is so high.
They're not going for it.
Right? Yeah. They're not going for it. So, but as for me, right, I'm at peace. Yeah. I am good. Right.
Well, I got some questions for you now. We on the pod, y'all, and this is our space to have conversations. And we talk so much about these efforts from a stance of, being practitioners, and regardless, you have your company, K Savannah Consulting.
I do.
That you already have contracts that you're, building in that way, as you decide what this period of time looks like for you. But I got some questions.
Go ahead. Now I'm on the hot seat.
She's on the hot seat.
Sorry, but I remember the was it lost tapes from the last episode when Kua was on the hot seat?
Exactly. Now we're reversing those roles a little bit. Because you asked me a lot of different questions, right, about that transition. And that was a transition that I had some time to prepare for. I was in the trenches, but, I want to kind of reverse that and talk to you about what that's like. So, I'm your friend, first and foremost. We do this podcast, obviously, where we co-host, but I've been with you in that journey, right? Like every step of the way, the conversations you had, the things that you can and can't say even now, right? Like I have that awareness of it, but I want to talk to you about just the emotional, I guess, roller coaster of that. And we talked about Black women specifically being in these specific roles and navigating that. Let's talk about that. Let's kind of unpack a little bit of that. This is like, the therapy couch a little bit.
Try to lay out a little bit.
But yeah, how were you through that process emotionally? What did you rely on in those different moments? And kind of just, give us some insight into your thought process.
Yeah. At that point, or a couple of weeks ago, I've had the official formal title of DEI for 4 years.
Right.
And both of us have been in the trenches for so long, to a point where sometimes you feel like you can't breathe.
Yeah.
Right? You feel like, oh my gosh, is this pressure ever going to end? Are things ever going to change? Right? And the answer that I kept saying to myself is, it's not going to change unless you're giving the proper resources to do so. Right? And in the environments that I was in, we didn't always have the resources to make that change, but we still had the pressures of the showing outcome, showing up and having the outcome. Yeah. And also showing up means physically showing up. And there's days where I just didn't want to physically show up. I just wanted to hide because I was exhausted, right? And so couple of weeks ago when they eliminated my role in all of our roles, it was more so of, initially I was shocked, like, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And I would say this, the reason being is because I was going through this moment where I'm like, man, what am I going to do? But at the end of the day, I am not my title.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that comes with a lot, because so many people know you from, like, hey, you work here. Hey, I know you at this organization. Especially being in our small town, people associate you with organizations and titles. And so I felt like, man, do I have nothing to bring to the table or any value because I don't have this title? And I'll be completely honest, on one of the boards that I sit on, someone said, oh, can I take your title away and put you as community volunteer? I was like, oh, community volunteer, you know what I mean?
Which is something that you do anyways.
Right? And that is a title. Yeah. But it was a moment where I was saying, I am not my title. And I have to keep saying that. So that was the first thing. And the other thing is that, for me, I have something on my nightstand that says never lose yourself. And I put it in a place where I have to look at it every day before I literally leave my bedroom and go out for the day. And so I had to keep going back to never losing yourself and never lose your values. And I felt like in those moments I was losing myself and my values. And I'm not, I'm a person that will say yes to a lot of different things and say, yes, I can do it.
And something we always be like, okay, Kendra, do you have the capacity?
Right, do you have the
I say that because I'm the same way, but you know what I mean?
Right. But that was, in the company, that was a fight that I just wasn't going to win. Right. And I had to be okay with that. Right. I did what I needed to do. I made the connections I needed to make and influence the people who I needed to influence, because there was still great work that was done. Sure. Right. At the end of the day, but where I am now, a couple of weeks later, I'm like, I am good. Yeah. I am at peace.
You're breathing different. You're absolutely breathing different.
I feel like got a little, a
little pep in your step.
Little pep in my step, walking straight. Yeah. But I feel different.
Yeah. And so, in a lot of different cases, you hear about people, either their role being eliminated. When you go on LinkedIn, you're seeing a litany of posts, right? And not just from a DEI perspective, but other different roles. I know someone recently who lost their job at Netflix, and they were doing some really cool work for a very long time as well. And you're starting to see some of these larger companies. So we talked about this, I think even last week when we recorded, but places like Amazon, X, I think Microsoft, all these larger big tech firms. Zoom was another one that had, originally it was like, oh, there were 30 roles, then it went to 2. And now they're completely gone. And so a lot of conversations are around, oh, it's the economics, right? Because we're living in a society right now that's heavily inflated, and resources are limited, but it's just interesting the roles that they're eliminating, right? And so they're seen as not being a necessity for the organization. This is a nice to have, even though 4 years ago, this was something that everybody wanted, and we're doubling down and putting our stance in there. And so I think at this point, as you start to kind of see people who have been laid off in the roles, they're really navigating. Although it's tough, right? At any given point in time, these folks had jobs, they had income coming in, and now, a day later, there's no funds now. You don't have a connection. And there's people that we know personally who are still looking for jobs, and it's been a year. Yes. Right? And so I think from that standpoint, it could be scary, but one of the things that resonated with me and you going through this process, and even talking to you the day of, and the day after, you talked about, I feel like this was the right, I
feel like a weight has been
lifted. It's a weight that's been lifted off of your shoulder.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And one thing I have to keep going back to is rest is a form of resistance.
Absolutely.
Right. And so you cannot keep fighting the good fight without proper rest. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I've been doing, right? And that includes not just physical rest, because I was getting my sleep, y'all, but it's the mental rest that comes with it, and just now recalibrating what your life now looks like. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, we're still always going to do equity work.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so it may not be completely in the trenches with the DEI title, but you're always going to do some form of equity work. And that's something that I will never lose from myself, right? Yeah. Yeah. And so, but to your point about waking up the next day, you're just like, okay, well, I don't have a job, right? Yeah. And what that looks like, and also too, it could be months, it could be a year, whatever the case may be.
We ain't claiming that though.
No. Okay. No, we're not claiming that. But for people who
that's their reality,
right? It's a scary reality, right? But we have to continue to be creative and to infiltrate in places where we're wanted, right? Or create our own, right? That is the other. That is the other. The avenue is creating your own. So that's where I am now in creating my own. I've always had K Savannah Consulting and had to take a back seat due to a full-time role. But one thing that someone always said to me within my last role was that continue to maintain your outside relationships because you never know when you may need them. Absolutely. And because I've done that, literally the first day I said, "Oh, y'all, I got laid off." Yeah. They're like, "Oh, I got some work for you. I got some contracts. Let's go. Let's talk," whatever the case may be. And so I'm very thankful for that. And so now I'm exploring what that looks like while building the infrastructure of a business and now starting a second business.
Yeah. And see, that's what happens, y'all. You know,
your brain just keeps going.
Your brain keeps going, but then you got some space. I think that's the other thing. And we talked about this in my transition, but just having the space to breathe and think. And you mentioned The Rest is Resistance. Yes. I actually read that book right before I left my full-time job. And it was notions of, y'all, our people work for free for how many centuries, right? Like in terms of this country. And I think that was something that resonated with me, right? Like our people paved the way in so many different ways, right? Like we really were at the forefront in the formation of this country. And now, you know, how do we remind ourselves that rest is necessary and that we desire and deserve that space to really take a break and take a step back, right? There's a challenge that I think we all have. We're ambitious women, but at the same time, challenging yourself to really put yourself first, and that sometimes is tough.
Yeah, because you only got one life to live.
Exactly.
Period.
Exactly.
There's nothing else. Period. You got one life to live. Right. And yes, you want to make it a great life, right? But you can't do that without rest.
Yeah. So So y'all, it's a lot of changes, but we're thankful because you're positioned very well, right? We already claiming it. We claiming.
And let me say this: everything that we've claimed, it has happened. It has happened, right?
Really
and
has.
It may not be in the form that you wanted, in the time that you wanted. But this is me.
Look, this is a word. This is a word, and you're right.
It may not be in the form because one thing I've said was, you may not believe or not. Yeah. But I said, God, please grant me rest, and please let me see and have the vision of what is next in my life, because what I'm doing right now is not it. Yeah. Yeah. And He gave me a few nudges along the way, and I didn't listen. Right. But this time He's like, you gotta go.
And now it's like, okay, so it's clear. It's clear.
Okay, I heard you, right? It may not be in the form and timing that you wanted, but He's listening. And
it's on the way.
I could preach, y'all, because
it's on the way.
It's on the way.
You know, and we also talked about, I had a good friend of mine who talked about, don't run away from a job, run to a job.
You've always said that to me, too.
Right? And this was something my good friend Jess had mentioned, you know, and this was many moons ago in terms of a different role. But, you know, you sometimes get frustrated in different roles and you're like, I just got to get out of here. So I'm going to, you know, leave and take the first thing. But oftentimes we need to kind of pause and sit down and think about the type of opportunities that we want. Right. And so what are those opportunities, ma'am? What are the opportunities that you're trying to run towards? Yes. Let's just put that out there. You never know who's listening.
Yes. So I am currently taking clients for K Savannah Consulting. Hey. You know, I am re-strategizing what the business side does look like. Okay. In terms of my mission and my vision for my business. As DEI is changing, not to say that I won't be in DEI, like I said, always equity work, but not forming it as a DEI consulting company. Okay. But I am taking clients. And then also to the Out of Bounds.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Out of Bounds is another business that I started. Again, it may not be, like I said, in the form that you want in the timing, but it's always on His time. And so Out of Bounds really started off as a blog. Okay. Years ago, because as a former student athlete, I just needed an outlet just to get my thoughts and my frustrations out. And so I started a blog called Out of Bounds. And the whole premise is what happens when the lights go dim and you step outside of the four parameters or, you know, lines of a basketball court. Yeah. And so that's how it started. And then it turned into a chapter of a book and co-authoring a book. Yeah. And then now it's a business and really helping former student athletes transition into the real world, which I have firsthand experience from, obviously.
Absolutely.
And what tools and resources. And I know that the game has changed. Obviously, so many things have affected that, from NIL deals to whatnot. And so really just doing right now little positive focus groups from student athletes and just seeing, like, you know, what things are you struggling with right now? And so that is another business that I am building out.
Absolutely.
And again, it's crazy to say, but something I started, 6-7 years ago, from a blog to a business, from a blog to a business.
Okay. That sounds like a blog post.
It's a tagline.
Some type of tagline of some sort. But, you know, I think
book number 2. I don't know.
That, and that's been a space you're, you know, been an athlete for a very long time, and kind of going back to that space. And, you know, I did track and field. I threw for 2 years at UB. And they don't talk about that transition often, right? So I only did it for 2 years. I knew I wasn't going to be no Olympian, y'all. I wasn't going into that direction, but I also knew, you know, that a lot of other folks that was their desire. They planned to go do D1 sports, and then they planned to transition into some type of professional sports. And that's not the case for many people.
No, not at all. Not at all. And, you know, one thing I always say is that being a student athlete has led me into the work that I'm doing today. And so building off on that, building off of community, connectivity, team, all those different things, which gives me the real life experience to really talk about what true DEI works look like as well.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited for you.
I'm excited.
I'm excited for you.
I literally said in 2023 at the end, I said, get ready for 2024. It's about to be crazy.
Listen.
But I'm embracing it. That's the difference. Like, old Kendra would have probably fell out, but new Kendra, I'm embracing it, you know, and it's a good time.
And beautifully too. I have to just add that, because yes, you know, in that moment, you know, we talked through it, right? But you also right away didn't sit in it and didn't revel in it too long. You're just like, okay, well, this is a space that I find myself in. Thankfully you already had some stuff in motion. And I truly believe, y'all, she's going to have a whole host of opportunities coming her way, and she's going to have to choose what she wants to do. So I'm just saying that y'all better, if y'all want her, you better try to get her early. Call her now, because already the opportunities are starting to come your way. So I'm excited about what's to come for you. We know it's going to be big. We know it's going to be great.
Thank you.
And in alignment with what you want.
Alignment, absolutely.
We naming and claiming, y'all.
Yes.
Naming and claiming.
Yeah.
So.
I felt like I was in a Dr. Phil session.
Listen.
But you know, so we always leave people with a gem, right? So I'm gonna go to you. What's your gem of the day?
Okay, so yesterday I was awarded and I'm trying to remember, it was the Erie County Commission for the Status of Women. And so they gave me an award in terms of the work that I'm doing in the DEI and equity space specifically. And they allowed us to say a couple words. And one of the things that I had mentioned, especially as it relates to these DEI efforts being under attack, is us really taking time to go back in the history books. And so, you know, I'm Ghanaian on my dad's side. The word Sankofa means to go back, remember the history in order to know where we're going forward, you know, how we're going to go forward and how we're going to move forward. And so one of the things that I left the audience with was, we have a whole host of history we can go and look back on. We talked about the Memphis trip last time and how we looked at all the things that our ancestors have done before us. And now I think is a real true time to stand on their shoulders, you know, to really give them a nod in the history that has come before us, and know that if they can do it in these type of dire situations, right? It's in our DNA, it's in our blood, right? And so we're going to carry that torch forward. I think I just implore everybody that's listening, you know, to dig deep, right? Go back to your ancestry, whether that's ancestry in your family, you know, going back and looking at things like the National Civil Rights Museum, but just get connected and understand just the movements that have happened and how we got here, right? And so this isn't anything new. We've been here before and it might have not looked the exact same, but we've been here before, right? And so we can't allow what's happening to really detour us from the things that we need to do. So that's my gem. Go back, y'all. Go back.
Go back. I'm going to go back to something that we talked about earlier. Rest is resistance. And take the time to rest. And what does rest look like? You know, for me, it's not necessarily going to sleep and taking a nap.
Bubble bath.
But bubble bath, even though I love my bubble baths. But it's not necessarily that. But it's like, what is sustainable rest looking like in your life, right?
That's real.
And so that's something that I'm evaluating. I've been putting up boundaries for a while now. So that's something that I've been practicing. And what they call in Atomic Habits, habit building or, you know, things like that. But what does rest look like? And so for me, it's something that I need to consciously embed into my life, and not just in the form of what we see as external self-care.
Right.
And then also too, this past week, I went to the Smithsonian African American History Museum and Culture down in DC, and I've been there so many times, y'all, but it's such a great just experience. And I didn't do the entire museum. I did a new exhibit that was focused on Afrofuturism, which was amazing. It's only there for a short period of time, so if you're down there, definitely go and check it out. But I went into the reflection room, and I sat there for an hour.
Okay.
And I just sat there, and I was just thinking and praying and journaling and really looking at what does my life look like moving forward. And they had several quotes on the wall. And going back to what you were saying is really looking at our ancestors, what they went through. And again, this is nothing new. And if they can do it, we can do it. We just need rest.
Right.
But we can do it. And so that really gave me the energy to keep going and not to be angry, right? Not to be angry. Don't leave with anger in your heart, but just to keep moving forward, you know, and really pushing this thing forward, because it's going to take all of us.
All of us. We always talk about the collective and how we got to come together. And we do. Yeah. We do. We don't have any other choice.
Yeah.
Right.
We have no other, that's the thing. We have no other choice, period.
Right.
Like no other choice. So
exactly. So good things are coming. Yes. Listen, good things are coming. We naming it, we claiming it.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you for sharing your story with the people, y'all. Like I said, y'all better holler at her now. But yeah, it's a great episode. Yeah. We will be back next week.
We will be back.
All right. Peace.
Bye, y'all.